Cold War. The Cold War was a period of intense geopolitical tension between the United States and the Soviet Union, along with their respective allies. It lasted from the end of World War II in 1945 until the early 1990s. Unlike a traditional hot war, the Cold War was characterized by political, economic, and military rivalry without direct large-scale armed conflict between the two superpowers. This script explores the origins, key events, and eventual conclusion of the Cold War, providing a comprehensive overview of this pivotal era in world history. The aftermath of World War II. The Cold War's roots can be traced back to the end of World War II. The Allied powers, led by the United States, the Soviet Union, and Great Britain, had defeated the Axis powers. However, the wartime alliance quickly unraveled. The ideological differences between the capitalist West, led by the United States, and the communist East, led by the Soviet Union, became increasingly apparent. The Yalta and Potsdam Conferences. In February 1945, the Yalta Conference was held. The Big Three, U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin, discussed the post-war world order. The conference laid the groundwork for the United Nations, but also revealed deep-seated tensions, particularly over the fate of Eastern Europe. By July 1945, at the Potsdam Conference, the relationship between the Allies had further deteriorated. The U.S. had a new president, Harry S. Truman, who was more suspicious of Soviet intentions. The conference ended with disagreements over reparations, the administration of Germany, and the political future of Eastern Europe. The Iron Curtain descends. In a speech delivered in March 1946, Winston Churchill famously declared that an Iron Curtain had descended across Europe. This metaphor symbolized the division of Europe into two opposing blocs, the democratic West and the communist East. It became a defining image of the Cold War. The early Cold War, 1947 to 1962, the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. In 1947, President Truman announced the Truman Doctrine. He pledged to support free peoples resisting subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures. This policy was first applied in Greece and Turkey, where the U.S. provided economic and military aid to prevent communist takeovers. The same year, Secretary of State George C. Marshall proposed the Marshall Plan. This was a massive economic aid program to help rebuild war-torn Europe. The plan aimed to prevent the spread of communism by fostering economic stability and prosperity. The Berlin Blockade and Airlift. In 1948, the Soviet Union blockaded West Berlin in an attempt to force the Western Allies out of the city. In response, the U.S. and its allies organized the Berlin Airlift. For nearly a year, they supplied the city with food and fuel via air. The blockade was eventually lifted in May 1949, marking a significant victory for the West. The formation of NATO and the Warsaw Pact. In April 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, was established. It was a military alliance of Western nations created to counter the Soviet threat. In response, the Soviet Union formed the Warsaw Pact in 1955. This created a military alliance of communist states in Eastern Europe. The Korean War. The Cold War turned hot in 1950 when North Korea, backed by the Soviet Union and China, invaded South Korea. The United Nations, led by the U.S., intervened to support South Korea. The Korean War lasted until 1953 and ended in a stalemate. Korea remained divided along the 38th parallel. The Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cold War reached its most dangerous point in October 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The U.S. discovered that the Soviet Union was installing nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida. After a tense 13-day standoff, the crisis was resolved. The Soviets agreed to remove the missiles in exchange for the U.S. promising not to invade Cuba and secretly removing missiles from Turkey. The Middle Cold War, 1962 to 1979. The Space Race. The Cold War rivalry extended into space exploration. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite. This sparked the space race. The U.S. responded with the Apollo program, culminating in the Apollo 11 mission in 1969. Neil Armstrong became the first human to walk on the moon. The Vietnam War. The Vietnam War, from 1955 to 1975, was another major conflict of the Cold War. The U.S. supported South Vietnam in its fight against the communist North Vietnam and the Viet Cong. The war was highly controversial and resulted in significant loss of life. The U.S. eventually withdrew in 1973, and South Vietnam fell to the Communists in 1975. Détente. In the 1970s, the U.S. and the Soviet Union entered a period of détente. This was characterized by a relaxation of tensions and efforts to reduce the risk of nuclear war. Key events included the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, known as SALT I and SALT II, and the signing of the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, or ABM Treaty, in 1972. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Détente came to an end in 1979 when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. Their goal was to support a communist government facing a rebellion. The U.S. responded by providing support to the Afghan Mujahideen. This marked the beginning of a new phase of Cold War confrontation. The end of the Cold War, 1980 to 1991. The Reagan Doctrine. In the 1980s, U.S. President Ronald Reagan adopted a more aggressive stance against the Soviet Union. This policy, known as the Reagan Doctrine, involved supporting anti-communist movements around the world. Examples include Afghanistan, Nicaragua, and Angola. The arms race and SDI. Reagan also escalated the arms race. He increased defense spending and proposed the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI. This was a space-based missile defense system. The Soviet Union, already struggling with economic problems, found it increasingly difficult to keep up with U.S. military spending. Gorbachev and reform. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became the leader of the Soviet Union. He introduced significant reforms, including glasnost, meaning openness, and perestroika, meaning restructuring. These reforms aimed to modernize the Soviet economy and political system. However, they also led to increased demands for independence in Soviet satellite states. The fall of the Berlin Wall. In 1989, a wave of revolution swept across Eastern Europe. This led to the fall of communist regimes. The most symbolic event was the fall of the Berlin Wall on November 9, 1989. It marked the end of the division of Germany and the beginning of the end of the Cold War. The dissolution of the Soviet Union. The Cold War officially ended in 1991 when the Soviet Union dissolved. The once mighty superpower broke apart into 15 independent republics. This marked the end of the bipolar world order that had defined international relations for nearly half a century. The Cold War was a complex and multifaceted conflict that shaped the second half of the 20th century. It was a period of intense rivalry, but also one of remarkable technological and scientific advancements. The legacy of the Cold War continues to influence global politics, economics, and culture to this day. As we reflect on this era, it serves as a reminder of the importance of diplomacy, the dangers of ideological extremism, and the enduring human desire for peace and freedom.